There was a Britain once, quieter, grittier, and unmistakably its own. A Britain of terrace streets, foggy school runs, and weekend drives to the seaside in cars that smelled of vinyl and damp carpet. The 1970s were not glamorous years. Strikes rattled the great industries, oil prices soared overnight, and the family budget was stretched painfully thin across every household in the land. And yet, in the midst of all that uncertainty, the British motor industry kept building cars, affordable, ordinary, and deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. Some of those cars were quietly admired. Some were gently mocked. And some, against every expectation, became something far greater than anyone could have imagined. This is a countdown of 10 cheap British cars from the 1970s that didn't just fill the nation's roads, they filled people's lives. Stay with us until the end, because number 1 didn't just lead the sales charts, it defined what British motoring truly meant. Let's begin with number 10. Number 10, Austin Allegro. Launched in 1973 and built at British Leyland's Longbridge plant in Birmingham, the Austin Allegro arrived at a moment when British families needed something reliable and affordable above all else. It was aimed squarely at the ordinary buyer, the factory worker, the junior clerk, the young couple setting up home for the very first time. Behind the wheel, it offered a reasonable ride for its class, with hydrogas suspension giving it a slightly floaty quality that divided opinion from the start. But the Allegro had its troubles. Rust arrived early, build quality was inconsistent, and its unusual Quartic steering wheel became an easy target for the press. Yet despite the criticism, it sold in genuine numbers, over 640,000 units across its production life. What made it endure was simpler than any specification sheet could ever explain. Number 9, Vauxhall Viva. The Vauxhall Viva had already established itself through the 1960s before carrying its reputation into the new decade with renewed confidence. Built at Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, the HC Viva, as the final generation was known, offered clean lines and a straightforward driving experience that appealed to buyers who wanted something modern without paying a premium. It was the sort of car that sat on every other street, parked outside semi-detached houses, waiting at the school gates, dutifully ferrying families from one errand to the next. Economy was its strongest argument, and for many households, that was argument enough. Mechanically it was simple, which was largely seen as a virtue in difficult times. But hidden beneath that sensible surface was a story of corrosion and compromise that not every buyer understood until the bills arrived. Number 8, Hillman Avenger. Chrysler's British arm produced the Hillman Avenger beginning in 1970, assembled at the Wrighton-on-Dunsmore plant in Coventry, and it entered a crowded market with quiet determination. Where rivals shouted about innovation, the Avenger offered familiarity, rear-wheel drive, conventional mechanicals, and a solidity that felt reassuring rather than exciting. Young families found it practical, salesmen found it dependable, and rally drivers, surprisingly, found it fast. The Avenger competed credibly in international motorsport, which gave the everyday model a certain reflected glory that money couldn't buy. On British roads, it blended in entirely, which was in some ways its greatest quality. It wasn't asking to be noticed. It was simply there, morning after morning, mile after faithful mile. Yet that quiet reliability masked a deeper truth about what British buyers were really searching for in these uncertain years. Number 7, Morris Marina. Few cars from this era provoke as strong a reaction as the Morris Marina, and that reaction has always been complicated. British Leyland introduced it in 1971, manufactured at Cowley in Oxford, as a conventional alternative to the more technically adventurous models in the company's range. It used tried and tested mechanicals, which meant production was straightforward, and sales, initially at least, were impressively strong. Fleet buyers took to it readily. Private buyers followed. At its peak, it ranked among the best-selling cars in Britain. But reliability concerns mounted, and the press grew unkind. The Marina became something of a national punchline, and yet millions of ordinary people drove one without incident, year after year. Behind the jokes lay something more honest, a car that served its purpose quietly and entirely without complaint. Number 6, Triumph Doomite. The Triumph Doomite occupied an interesting position in the British market, a compact saloon that carried genuine class aspirations without demanding a price beyond most buyers' reach. Produced at Canley in Coventry from 1972, it offered style, a refined interior, and an engine note that felt considerably more purposeful than the family hatchbacks of the time. The Doomite Sprint variant, with its 16-valve engine, genuinely surprised motoring journalists when it was first tested. But even the standard models carried a sense of occasion that competitors struggled to match at the same price point. Rust was an issue, as it was for nearly everything on British roads in this decade, but loyalty to the Triumph name ran remarkably deep. Stay with us, because one of the cars still to come didn't just sell well, it changed the very shape of British motoring entirely. Number 5. Ford Cortina MK3. No conversation about 1970s British motoring is complete without the Ford Cortina, and the Mark III generation, launched in 1970 and built at Dagenham in Essex, was the decade's great workhorse. It was everywhere: sales charts, car parks, company fleets, suburban driveways. Ford understood precisely what the British buyer wanted: space, ease of driving, affordability, and just enough style to feel current. The Cortina delivered all of it without drama, which was precisely its genius. Mechanics knew it well, spare parts were abundant, and servicing remained refreshingly inexpensive. For the company car driver and the private buyer alike, it was the rational choice, and rationally, Britain responded in remarkable numbers. But what separated the Cortina from merely popular and placed it firmly into legendary is something genuinely worth pausing to consider. Number 4. Vauxhall Cavalere MK1. Vauxhall's answer to the Cortina arrived in 1975, and it arrived with quiet confidence. The first-generation Cavalere, assembled initially in Belgium before UK production grew, brought a continental feel to a very British conversation about affordable motoring. Its styling felt a touch more European than what domestic buyers were accustomed to, and that freshness worked strongly in its favour. Middle management took to it readily. Young professionals saw in it a certain aspiration that plainer alternatives simply couldn't offer. It drove well enough, offered reasonable space, and projected an image of mild success without ostentation. Fleet sales were substantial. Reliability was broadly acceptable. What the Cavalere proved, more than anything, was that British drivers in this decade were quietly beginning to want something more than mere transportation. Number 3. Ford Escort MK2. If the Cortina was the sensible choice, the Ford Escort was the personal one. The Mark II Escort, launched in 1975 and built at Halewood in Merseyside, became one of the most important small cars of the decade, not merely because of its sales figures, which were exceptional, but because of what it meant to its owners. It was the car that young drivers saved carefully for. The car that first appeared on a driveway when a family moved into their first home together. Its motorsport success, multiple rally victories across Europe, lent the everyday version a glamour entirely disproportionate to its modest price. Even the base models felt quietly special in a way that was difficult to articulate but utterly impossible to ignore. And the story of the Escort was far from finished yet. Number 2. Austin Maxi. The Austin Maxi deserves considerably more recognition than history has afforded it. Introduced in 1969 and continuing strongly through the 1970s, built at Longbridge in Birmingham, it was, in many ways, ahead of its time. A genuine 5-door hatchback with a flexible interior long before the format became the default choice for British families. Hydraulic suspension, a 5-speed gearbox, and folding rear seats made it remarkably practical for its era. The problem was execution. Early models suffered reliability issues that damaged confidence, and British Leyland's industrial troubles hardly helped the Maxi's reputation on the forecourt. Yet for those who persevered, it offered something genuinely intelligent. Perhaps the greatest irony is that nearly everything the Maxi pioneered became completely standard a decade later, in cars built by someone else entirely. But nothing had prepared Britain for what was to come at number 1. Number 1, Mini. And here we arrive, not merely at number 1, but at something approaching a national institution. The Mini was born in 1959, but it was the 1970s that truly cemented its place in the very soul of Britain. Still built at Longbridge and later at Cowley, it remained in continuous production through decades of change, industrial unrest, and economic uncertainty, a constant when very little else was. What made the Mini remarkable wasn't any single specification. It was the fact that it transcended every category anyone attempted to place it in. The young bought it, the elderly bought it, the wealthy bought it, the working class bought it. It appeared in advertisements, on television, and on every conceivable street across the entire country. Its front-wheel drive layout and transverse engine had introduced a mechanical template that the rest of the world eventually followed without exception. And through all the economic turbulence of the decade, the Mini simply endured, compact, characterful, and entirely irreplaceable. No other car from this era said more about Britain, and no other car earned its place at the very top of this list more completely or more deservedly. The 1970s were not easy years for Britain. Industrial disputes, rising inflation, power cuts, and a creeping sense that the old certainties were quietly dissolving, these were the textures of the decade. And yet through all of it, people still needed to get to work, to take the children to school, to visit aging parents on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Cars made that possible. These weren't simply vehicles filling the roads, they were part of the rhythm of ordinary British life. They carried families through genuinely difficult years with quiet reliability, and they asked very little in return except for the occasional service and a modest amount of patience. When we look back at these cars today, we are not simply admiring old machines. We are remembering a version of Britain that faced its struggles with a certain stoic, unhurried dignity. If this video stirred a memory in you, perhaps a childhood journey, a first drive, or a car that once sat faithfully on your parents' driveway, do leave a comment below and share it with us. Subscribe to Britain Rewind for more stories from the decades that shaped this nation. And thank you, as always, for watching.